Everyone thinks Utah is a quiet, conservative desert state where nothing much happens. They are wrong. Utah is one of the most geologically violent, hydrologically stressed, and demographically explosive places in the entire Western Hemisphere. And the combination of those three forces happening simultaneously right now makes it one of the most important and most overlooked stories in America. Most people picture Utah and they see red rocks, maybe skiing, maybe the Mormon church. They think of a slow, spiritual, orderly place, the kind of state that doesn't make headlines because nothing goes wrong there. That perception is not just incomplete, it is almost the exact opposite of reality, because underneath that postcard surface, Utah is running one of the most dangerous experiments in modern American geography. It is growing faster than almost any state in the country, while its water supply is actively dying. It has built one of the most productive economies in the American West on top of a hydrological system that was already at its limit before the population explosion began, and it sits on a geological foundation that could, in the right conditions, produce a catastrophe so large that most people wouldn't believe the projections, until it was too late. This is the real Utah, and once you understand what is actually happening here, you cannot look at American growth the same way again. Start with the water, because everything in Utah comes back to water. The Great Salt Lake is dying. That sentence sounds like environmental hyperbole. It is not. The lake has lost roughly 2/3 of its volume since the mid-20th century. Its surface area has shrunk by more than half. In the 1980s, the lake was considered a nuisance because it flooded roads and caused property damage. Today, researchers are measuring how much lakebed is being exposed to open air, because the exposed lakebed is not just dry dirt. It contains arsenic, it contains mercury, it contains decades of accumulated industrial contamination that was safely submerged underwater. When the wind blows across the exposed lakebed, which it does constantly, those particles become airborne. They travel into Salt Lake City, into the schools, into the lungs of the 1.2 million people in the metro area directly downwind. This is not a projection. It has already begun. Air quality events tied to lakebed dust are already being documented. The question is not whether this becomes a serious public health problem. The question is, how serious? Before someone stops it. But here is the first mechanism you need to understand. The Great Salt Lake is a terminal lake. That means it has no outlet. Water flows in, but it cannot flow out. The only way water leaves the lake is through evaporation, which means the only way the lake stays full is if the rivers feeding it carry enough water to replace what evaporates. And that balance, inflow versus evaporation, has been systematically broken over the past century and a half. The rivers that feed the Great Salt Lake have been diverted. The Bear River, the Jordan River, the Weber River. Upstream, those rivers are dammed and redirected to support agriculture, cities, ski resorts, suburbs. The water that used to flow naturally into the lake is now being used, consumed, and in many cases permanently removed from the system before it ever reaches the terminal point. So the lake shrinks year after year, decade after decade. And here is where the growth story collides with the water story. Utah added more than 600,000 residents in a single decade. It is the second fastest growing state in the country by percentage. The Wasatch Front, the narrow strip of land running along the western edge of the Wasatch Mountains, is where almost all of that growth is concentrating. Salt Lake City, Provo, Ogden. This corridor is filling up at a speed that most American cities would consider alarming. New housing developments are appearing in valleys that were empty a decade ago. Tech companies are relocating here from California. Remote workers are discovering that Salt Lake City has the quality of life of a major city at a fraction of the cost. And every single new resident increases the demand on the same water system that is already failing to keep the lake alive. Because this is the thing about water in the American West that most people don't understand. The water in Utah is already allocated. Almost every drop that moves through the Colorado River Basin and the Great Basin is already legally claimed by someone. Farmers, cities, states, federal projects. The paperwork exists. The rights exist. On paper, the water is spoken for. But the physical water, the actual liquid, is no longer there in the quantities those rights assume. The West overpromised its water during the wet decades of the early 20th century. The century since has been drier, and the century ahead, based on every available climate model, will be drier still. Utah is building a metropolitan future on top of a water accounting system that was already technically insolvent before the building boom started. Now here's the second thing most people don't know about Utah, and this is where the geography stops being beautiful and starts being dangerous. Utah sits above one of the most seismically active fault systems in the western United States. The Wasatch Fault runs for roughly 240 miles along the same Wasatch Front corridor where almost the entire population of Utah lives. Salt Lake City, Provo, Ogden, the same strip of land, the same fault directly underneath it. The Wasatch Fault is a normal fault, which means the land on one side drops relative to the land on the other. The valley floors, the flat, buildable land where all the cities sit, are sitting in basins that were created by previous movements of this exact fault. The cities are built in the scar tissue of prehistoric earthquakes. Seismologists classify the Wasatch Fault as one of the most significant earthquake hazards in the United States. A major rupture of the full fault system could produce a magnitude 7.5 earthquake, or larger. The U.S. Geological Survey has estimated that such an event could kill thousands of people, destroy tens of thousands of buildings, and cause economic damage in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The population of the Wasatch Front has grown by hundreds of thousands of people in recent decades and is continuing to grow, which means the exposure to that risk is not static. It is compounding. But there is a specific mechanism here that makes the earthquake risk in Utah different from most earthquake scenarios. It is called liquefaction, and it is the piece of this story that the growth narrative almost never mentions. The valley floors along the Wasatch Front are full of ancient lake sediments because the entire region was once covered by Lake Bonneville, a massive prehistoric inland sea that covered most of western Utah and was significantly larger than any of the Great Lakes today. When Lake Bonneville drained, it left behind thick deposits of loose, water-saturated sediment, sand, silt, clay, and when you build cities on top of saturated, loosely packed sediment and then shake it with a major earthquake, the sediment doesn't behave like solid ground. It behaves like liquid. Buildings tilt, roads buckle, pipelines shear, infrastructure disappears into the ground. The soft valley sediments of the Wasatch Front have been mapped, the liquefaction risk zones have been identified, and the densest, fastest growing parts of the metropolitan area sit directly on top of the highest risk sediment deposits. This is the geometry of the problem. The water is in the mountains, the people are in the valley, the earthquake hazard is in the valley floor, the fault is along the mountain edge. Growth is filling in the spaces between all of these hazards simultaneously. Here is the economic dimension that ties it all together, because disasters become catastrophes when the systems that are supposed to absorb them are already under stress. Utah's economy is one of the fastest growing in the country. It has attracted major technology investment. It has low unemployment, a young workforce, and a business-friendly regulatory environment. By every conventional economic metric, Utah is a success story. Silicon Slopes, the tech corridor stretching from Salt Lake City south through Utah County, has been compared to a smaller, cheaper, still growing version of Silicon Valley. Companies like Adobe, Qualtrics, and dozens of others have substantial operations here. That economic success is real, but it is also creating the conditions for a more brittle system, because fast growth means infrastructure is always catching up. Water treatment plants, roads, power grids, emergency response capacity. In a fast-growing region, the gap between population and infrastructure is structural. It is baked into the growth model. You build the houses first because houses generate revenue. The water systems, the seismic retrofits, the emergency planning, those come later, funded by the tax base the houses produce. Except later keeps getting pushed further out because the growth keeps coming faster than the tax base can support the infrastructure. And now overlay the water crisis on that model. The state of Utah has proposed a major new water project for decades, the Bear River Development Project, which would divert additional water from the Bear River, the largest single tributary of the Great Salt Lake, to support continued growth along the Wasatch Front. The project is exactly the kind of infrastructure that growth advocates say is necessary. It is also exactly the kind of diversion that lake scientists say would be catastrophic for the already dying lake. The river that would be partially diverted is the same river that provides the single largest inflow to the Great Salt Lake. Taking more water out of that system to support more population growth would accelerate the lake's death. This is the central contradiction at the heart of Utah's future. The water that could support more growth is the same water that the existing ecosystem needs to survive. There is no version of this problem where you get both. You can have more growth or you can have a living lake. The political and economic system has not yet fully confronted that choice, but the hydrology has. There is a historical parallel worth sitting with here. The Aral Sea. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union diverted the rivers feeding the Aral Sea, one of the largest lakes in the world at the time, to support cotton agriculture in Central Asia. The lake began to shrink. Within decades, it had lost most of its volume. The fishing industry collapsed. The exposed lakebed became a source of toxic dust that spread across the surrounding region. Towns that were once fishing ports found themselves sitting dozens of miles from the shoreline. The agricultural economy the diversions were designed to support eventually collapsed anyway, because the regional climate had changed. The lake that once moderated temperatures and humidity was gone. The Great Salt Lake is not the Aral Sea. It is a different ecosystem in a different political context, with different resources available to respond, but the mechanism is identical. A terminal lake, upstream diversions, agricultural and urban demand, a shrinking shoreline, exposed toxic lakebed, a downstream population that will breathe whatever the wind carries. The only difference is the timeline and the response. The Soviet system never chose to stop. The question for Utah is whether a democratic system will choose to stop, or whether the economic logic of continued growth will win every annual budget cycle until the choice is made for them. Now, let's come back to the earthquake, because there is a connection between the water system and the seismic system that almost no one talks about. When a major earthquake hits the Wasatch Front, and geologists do not say if, they say when, one of the first systems to fail will be the water infrastructure. Pipelines that cross active fault traces will shear. Water treatment plants built on soft sediment will be damaged. The Jordan River corridor, which carries treated water through the valley, runs directly over some of the highest risk liquefaction zones in the region. After a major Wasatch earthquake, the Wasatch Front could lose functional water service for weeks, potentially longer, in a region that already does not have enough water in its long-term supply to support current population trends. Losing the delivery infrastructure for weeks or months is not just a hardship, it is a potential trigger for population displacement at a scale that American cities almost never contemplate. People do not stay in cities without water. This is the most fundamental rule of urban survival there is, and the city that is growing faster than almost any other in America is building on top of a fault that could remove its water delivery capacity and a water supply crisis that is already at the edge of what the system can sustain. This is the twist at the center of the Utah story, and it changes the frame entirely. Everyone who talks about Utah's growth talks about it as a success. Companies moving in, population booming, economy diversifying, housing market hot, and yes, those things are real, but the thing that actually threatens Utah's future is not the growth itself. The growth is the symptom. The real threat is the mismatch between the growth model and the physical geography it is being built on top of. Utah is one of the driest states in the country. It receives roughly 13 inches of precipitation per year on average, less than almost any other state outside of Nevada. Its rivers are fed by snowpack in the mountains, and that snowpack is declining as temperatures rise. The Colorado River, which contributes water to the southern part of the state, is itself in crisis, overallocated, shrinking, the subject of multi-state legal battles that have not been resolved. The Great Salt Lake is dying. The aquifers are being drawn down, and onto all of this, Utah is layering one of the most aggressive population growth curves in the country. The geography does not care about the economic model. The water table does not adjust to accommodate the housing development timeline. The fault does not wait for the retrofit schedule. These are physical systems with physical limits, and those limits are being approached, in some cases exceeded, right now, in real time, while the suburbs continue to expand and the tech campuses continue to be announced and the population continues to arrive. What makes Utah worth watching, genuinely watching, not just as a regional story, but as a national one, is what happens when the contradiction becomes undeniable. Because the United States as a whole is running a version of the same experiment, growing into places that cannot physically support the growth model being applied to them. The Southwest, the Colorado Basin, coastal flood zones, urban areas built on alluvial plains above failing aquifers. Utah is just running the experiment more transparently in a smaller geography, with clearer stakes and a faster timeline. If Utah finds a way through real water conservation, growth limits that actually connect to hydrological capacity, seismic infrastructure investment at the scale the risk requires, then it becomes a model. If it doesn't, if the economic and political incentives continue to override the physical signals until the system breaks, then it becomes a warning. Either way, it stops being a quiet story that doesn't make headlines. The Great Salt Lake lost another foot of elevation last year. The Wasatch Fault has not produced a major rupture since before before European settlement of the region, which means the stress has been accumulating for at least 350 years. The population of the Wasatch Front is projected to double by 2065. All three of those lines are moving in the same direction, toward each other, toward a point of convergence that the current growth narrative doesn't include in its projections. That is the real Utah, not the red rocks, not the ski slopes, not the Silicon Slopes press release. The real Utah is a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary fragility, growing at extraordinary speed toward a set of physical limits that are much closer than the economic story suggests. And the reason most people don't know this is the same reason most of the biggest stories in the American West go untold. Because the timeline is long enough that each individual year looks fine. The lake is lower, but the city still has water. The fault hasn't moved, but the buildings are still standing. The population grew again, but the roads still work. It is only when you zoom out, when you look at the direction of every trend simultaneously, that the picture becomes clear. And the picture is this: Utah is not a quiet state where nothing happens. Utah is a state where everything is happening at once, beneath the surface, in the water table, and the fault lines, and the shrinking shoreline of a dying inland sea. And the clock on all of it is running faster than the growth story admits. What happens when it all converges? Leave your answer in the comments, because this is the question that determines whether the Utah story ends as a model or a warning, and nobody knows yet which one it will be.